Vernier calipers are one of the most common and most useful tools that we have in our toolbox. They're used for measuring quick measurements of bolts. We can get diameters. We can get lengths by measuring using the back side of it. We can get an overall measurement. Now, there are three types of Vernier calipers. We have two here. I'll explain. The first and simplest type doesn't have a gauge, so it essentially is going to look just like that. And as you move the caliper out to measure whatever you're going to measure, you're going to just read whatever the size is where this steel piece lines up with. The next style is what I have here, which is the dial indicator style. And what these will do is you will zero it, and you zero the gauge by simply twisting it to zero. And then as you measure, so if we're going to measure our bolt, we're going to bring it out and pick up on the edge. What we're going to do is we're going to measure off the large number here, which is 20, and then we're going to look at the vernier scale in the dial here to see if there's any differences. Now, the other style is digital. And digital calipers make it very easy to read, very easy to move. And even though this course is in metric, if you have to measure in standard, it's a one-button push, and now you've got standard numbers. So no conversion is needed. Same with these, you want to zero them each time before you use them. So you would press them in till they seat, and then you've got the zero button. So you can also use these as incremental measurements. So if you have a known height, let's say I was measuring down on something. So I've measured down on my bolt and my overall height is 24.68 millimeters. If I want to use that as my baseline and measure a bunch of different bolts as a comparison, I can zero at this point. Now I'm zeroed. If we go below that point, it'll give you a number in minus, and it'll give you a number in positive if it's larger. So we can use these calipers a lot easier than we can use the dial size. Now, the tolerance on these calipers are almost always around 0.02 of a millimeter. And the way that you use a caliper can also affect how accurate it is. So on this one we have a pin gauge. This is a precision ground piece of steel, and it's marked at 22.08 millimeters. So we know that this dimension is going to be correct. So if we measure them with our general caliper first, we're going to make sure that we're on zero. Another thing to bear in mind when you are zeroing, make sure that these two surfaces here are clean. I usually like to wipe them with my finger first, just to make sure that there's no little pieces of grit in the joint, otherwise that will affect your zero. Also, depending on how much pressure you place on them, you can cause these to bend. So you don't want to over pressurize it, both when setting zero and when measuring. So if we take our 22.08 millimeter pin and measure it with our calipers, this one right now is actually coming out at 22.07. So within the margin of error for the caliper. The next thing that we want to bear in mind too is keeping straight over the job. So if I have my caliper twisted when I measure, we can see that I end up at 22.72 millimeters, just because the caliper is not straight. So you have to be aware of how you angle the calipers while you're measuring. The other thing is pressure. If I place more pressure, you can see now I'm grabbing around, I'm actually forcing the verniers, and now I'm getting a reading that's closer to 22.05. So having the right amount of feel and the right amount of pressure and angle on the job when you're measuring is an important part of measuring with the calipers. Using something like a pin gauge, where it is a known dimension, is the perfect way to practice. That way you can get a feel for what it should be. Now, if you measure it and it comes up at 22.07 or 22.09, you are within the margin of error or the tolerance of the caliper. On these ones, you can see the tolerance is usually printed on the caliper, and it'll be marked right on the dial gauge where it says tolerance plus minus 0.02. Now, typically, a higher end caliper is going to be more accurate, but it is still going to operate in the same tolerance. This one is a name brand. This is a Fowler brand, which is a name brand of caliper. This one is an SPI. SPI is still a good quality. It's just on the cheaper scale of the range. So if we measure our same pin using the digital, we can see that we're coming up at 22.07, so we're getting the same measurement. It's just a lot quicker and a lot easier to see that. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the really cheap calipers. There are some plastic calipers out there that you can spend maybe $5 on, maybe $10 on. Those ones really are not worth any consideration in the automotive trade. They're good for a homeowner that needs to take some quick measurements of something or other, but I wouldn't use those in an automotive environment at all. Another thing that calipers can be used for is measuring inside diameters. So if we've got our carburetor body and we need to know a quick measurement on what size the throttle plate is, using the back side of the caliper, so we're going to use these inside points, we can bring this into the inside here. Now, taking this type of measurement can take a lot of practice because there's a couple of things that are going to influence it. You can see how I have to rock the calipers, I'm moving them both back and forth, and that's because I want to get this edge where it's parallel to the edge that I'm measuring, but I also, because I'm measuring an inside circle, I have to rock this way to get the correct reading. So these are a quick way to get an idea of what the throttle bore. Now, I know that this throttle bore is 40.0 millimeters. With my calipers, I'm getting 39.97 is about the most accurate I can get. Now, if I move the calipers while I'm watching the scale and I'm keeping a very slight pressure out on the caliper, I can use it to almost like a dial gauge where I can start to get a range of movement. So I'm looking for the largest measurement that I can get. And as you can see how much it's moving by the position. This is why calipers are great for taking a quick, yes, we know this is a 40 millimeter throttle bore and it hasn't been overbored to say a 41 or a 42 or whatever. But we don't want to rely on this particular tool to take an accurate measurement of this kind of size. To summarize, Vernier calipers are going to be one of the most useful tools in your toolbox. It's probably the most used tool for taking quick measurements and getting you an idea of where you are and whatever you are measuring. So make sure you have several sets, invest in some good quality calipers that will serve you well.